They say that mathematics is the only language that never lies. It doesn't care about your zip code, the color of your skin, or how much money is in your bank account. In the world of numbers, the truth is absolute. But in the freezing winter of 2024, right here in Detroit, one man tried to break that rule. He was a distinguished professor with a $200,000 salary and an ego that filled the room. She was Nia Robinson, a 12-year-old girl in a worn-out hoodie, fighting just to keep her grandmother warm. He thought he could use numbers to put her in her place. He thought his prestige was a shield that no child could pierce. He was wrong. This isn't just a story about a math problem. It is the story of a gamble that cost a man his career, and the quiet brilliance of a girl who proved that while numbers don't lie, people do. And sometimes, the smallest voice in the room is the only one speaking the truth. A pristine silver luxury sedan crunched over the dirty ice of the Roosevelt Middle School parking lot, looking like a spaceship that had landed in the wrong galaxy. The engine purred with a silence that cost more than the entire faculty's payroll, starkly contrasting with the rhythmic coughing of the school's broken heating vents. Inside room 204, the temperature hovered just above freezing. 12-year-old Nia Robinson pulled the sleeves of her frayed gray hoodie down over her knuckles, trying to trap whatever body heat she had left. She glanced at the window, sealed with duct tape to keep out the Detroit wind, and then at the clock. It was time. The door swung open, not with a creak, but with an aggressive bang. Professor Arthur Sterling strode in, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and gourmet coffee that masked the room's smell of damp plaster. He wore a camel hair coat that looked too soft to touch, and he scanned the classroom of shivering seventh graders with a look of undisguised disgust. To him, this wasn't a place of learning. It was a zoo, and he was unfortunately on the wrong side of the glass. He didn't even greet Ms. Miller, the homeroom teacher who shrank back against her desk, intimidated by his academic celebrity. So, Sterling announced, his voice booming without needing to be raised. These are the beneficiaries of the university's charity grant. He walked to the front, taking a silk handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the chalk dust off the chair before refusing to sit in it. Let's see if there is any intelligence hiding under those hoodies. He picked up a piece of chalk, grimacing at the texture, and turned to the blackboard. For 2 minutes, the only sound was the aggressive clack-clack-clack of chalk against slate. When he stepped back, the board was covered in a sprawling, complex partial differential equation, a mess of Greek symbols and variables that looked like alien hieroglyphics to the confused students. Does anyone here even know what language this is? Sterling sneered, turning to face them. He checked his gold Rolex, clearly counting the minutes until he could leave. I thought not. This is real mathematics. It separates the thinkers from the laborers. In the third row, a small hand went up. It didn't shoot up with eagerness, but rose with a steady, quiet determination. Sterling blinked, looking down his nose. Yes? Do you need a bathroom pass, child? Nia stood up. She looked tiny next to her desk, but her eyes were sharp. No, sir. I have a question about the equation. The variable sigma in the second term. Is that representing energy dissipation or accumulation? The class went silent. Ms. Miller's jaw dropped slightly. Sterling froze. He hadn't expected a question. He expected silence. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the cold walls. Energy dissipation? You learned a few big words from a comic book, didn't you? Don't pretend to understand things that are miles above your station. I'm not pretending, Nia said, her voice trembling just a little but holding firm. I just want to know if you wrote it right. Sterling's smile vanished. His face flushed a deep, angry red. To be questioned by a peer was annoying. To be questioned by a child in a crumbling school in Detroit was an insult he couldn't stomach. He slammed his hand down on the teacher's desk, making everyone jump. He leaned forward, staring directly at Nia with eyes cold enough to freeze the room completely. You think you're clever? If you can solve this by tomorrow, my entire annual salary, $200,000, is yours. But if you fail, you apologize on your knees. The bus ride home was silent, but Nia's mind was loud, replaying the number $200,000 over and over like a desperate prayer. In the fading light of the Detroit afternoon, that number didn't just mean money. It meant survival. It meant paying the heating bill that had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 3 months, staring at them like a silent threat. As she stepped off the bus and walked toward her apartment building, the wind bit through her thin jeans, reminding her of the cold reality awaiting her inside. Nia unlocked the door to apartment 4B and was greeted not by warmth, but by the sight of her breath puffing out in small white clouds. Mama Rose was sitting in her favorite armchair, wrapped in 3 layers of mismatched quilts, her worn Bible resting on her lap. She looked up and smiled a smile that warmed the room more than the broken radiator ever could. "Hey there, baby girl," Mama Rose said, her voice raspy. She coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Nia's chest tighten. "How was school? Did you learn something new?" "I learned a lot, Mama," Nia said softly, heating up a can of soup on the electric hot plate. She didn't mention the humiliation or the contract she had signed. She just looked at her grandmother's trembling hands and thought about the professor's arrogant wager. $200,000. That could buy a small bungalow with a working furnace. It could buy medicine that didn't require rationing. That night, after Mama Rose had fallen into a fitful sleep, Nia sat at the rickety kitchen table. The only light came from a flickering desk lamp and the glow of her cracked tablet screen. She wasn't playing games. She was at war. Beside her lay a stack of college textbooks she had rescued from the library's discard pile. For hours, the only sound was the scratching of her pencil against paper. She broke down Professor Sterling's equation piece by piece, treating it like a puzzle that held the key to her future. Around 2 a.m., her pencil stopped. Nia frowned, tapping the eraser against her chin. She cross-referenced the variables with a digital archive of physics journals she accessed through the public library's free database. She traced the logic of the second term, the one Sterling had mocked her for questioning. According to the math on the board, energy was being created out of nothing, multiplying infinitely without a source. Nia sat back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She checked her calculations again and again. The result was the same. The equation wasn't just difficult, it was fundamentally broken. It violated the first law of thermodynamics. No mathematician in the world could solve it because it described a physical impossibility. A cold realization washed over her, sharper than the winter air. Professor Sterling hadn't given her a test of intelligence. He had set a trap designed to humiliate a child. He was so arrogant, so sure of her ignorance, that he hadn't even bothered to check if his own impossible problem made sense. Nia whispered to the shadows, gripping her pencil until her knuckles turned white. "He didn't want me to solve it. He wanted to break me. But he made a mistake." Nia walked into room 20 for the next morning without her usual slump. Her head was high, and her notebook was clutched against her chest like a shield. The classroom was buzzing with nervous energy. Students whispered behind cupped hands, glancing from the empty chalkboard to the small girl who had dared to challenge the man in the expensive suit. Professor Sterling was already there, leaning against the teacher's desk with the casual arrogance of a king visiting his subjects. He had his smartphone out, the camera app open, ready to record what he was sure would be a viral moment of humiliation. Well, Sterling announced as the bell rang, silencing the room. "The prodigy returns." He pointed the phone directly at Nia's face. "The clock has run out, young lady. Do you have the solution to my equation, or are you ready to apologize to the class for wasting our time with your delusions of grandeur?" Nia stood up slowly. She didn't tremble this time. She walked to the front of the room, her sneakers squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. She stopped in front of the massive equation still scrawled on the board. She picked up a piece of red chalk, not the white one Sterling had used. "I can't solve this equation, Professor," Nia said clearly. Sterling let out a sharp, triumphant bark of laughter. "I knew it. Just as I expected. Now say it. Say, I am not smart enough to." "I can't solve it," Nia interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "because it's wrong." With a swift motion, she circled the second term of the equation in bright red. "This coefficient right here. In a closed system, energy cannot increase without a source. You wrote a positive integer where a negative one should be. This equation violates the law of conservation of energy. It's a trick question." The silence that followed was heavier than the one before. Miss Miller, who had been shrinking in the corner, suddenly grabbed her textbook. She flipped pages frantically, her finger tracing a line. She's right, Ms. Miller whispered, looking up in shock. The source material confirms it. The sign is reversed. It's impossible to solve as written. Sterling's face turned a shade of purple that matched his tie. The phone in his hand lowered slightly. He looked from Nia to Ms. Miller, then to the students who were no longer snickering, but staring at him with wide, judging eyes. His authority was cracking, and for a man like Sterling, that was unforgivable. He snatched the chalk from Nia's hand and crushed it into dust. You think finding a typo makes you a mathematician? He hissed, stepping close enough to invade her personal space. You memorized a fact? Cute. But you have no idea how real mathematics works. He straightened up, buttoning his coat to regain his composure. He wouldn't let this end in a dirty classroom. He needed to crush her spirit so completely that no one would remember this mistake. You want to play professor? Fine. Sterling spat, his eyes gleaming with malice. We'll settle this properly. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the University Grand Auditorium. We'll see if you can solve real problems in front of the press and the entire faculty. No hiding behind typos then. The University Grand Auditorium was a terrifying cavern of polished oak and burgundy velvet, buzzing with 2,000 whispers that felt like judgment. To Nia, standing backstage in her worn sneakers, the massive hall felt less like a place of learning and more like the inside of a hungry beast waiting to swallow her whole. The air was thick with the heat of television lights, blindingly bright, set up by local news crews hungry for a story about the professor versus the prodigy. In the front row, looking small and fragile, sat Mama Rose. She clutched her worn leather Bible so tightly her knuckles were white, her lips moving in silent prayer. Standing at the very back, almost blending into the shadows in his security uniform, was Mr. Henderson. He offered a small, grim nod when he caught Nia's eye, a silent reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in the lion's den. Professor Sterling walked onto the stage to scattered applause. He looked every bit the distinguished academic, wearing a fresh suit and a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. He adjusted the microphone, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, pacing theatrically. Today isn't about humiliation. It is about a much-needed lesson in reality. We must teach our youth that confidence cannot replace decades of education. He gestured to the curtain behind him, which parted to reveal a massive whiteboard on wheels. On it were 3 new equations. They were monstrously long, filled with complex integrals and number theory notations that made the audience gasp. Since Miss Robinson found a typo yesterday, Sterling sneered, emphasizing the word, I have personally prepared 3 problems that are flawless and significantly more advanced. Nia walked onto the stage. The silence was suffocating. She approached the board, the marker feeling heavy in her hand. She looked at the first equation. Her brow furrowed. She recognized the symbols. They were from quantum mechanics, similar to what she had studied the night before. But something was wrong. The variables were arranged in a chaotic, illogical sequence. She moved to the second problem. It was even worse. It mixed number theory with wave functions in a way that made no mathematical sense. It was like reading a sentence where the words were in random order. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. These weren't graduate-level problems. They were gibberish. Sterling hadn't just made them difficult. He had rigged them. He had jumbled the maths so thoroughly that they were impossible to solve because they asked for answers that didn't exist. He wasn't testing her intelligence. He was ensuring her failure by breaking the rules of math itself. Nia dropped her hand to her side, staring at the nonsense on the board. The trap had snapped shut. If she tried to solve them, she would look incompetent. If she said they were wrong again, the audience would think she was just making excuses. Sterling leaned into the podium microphone, his voice dripping with false sympathy that echoed through the auditorium. What's the matter, child? Cat got your algebra? Or are you finally ready to apologize and admit you're out of your depth? Nia didn't pick up the marker to write numbers. She picked it up like a sword. The fear that had paralyzed her a moment ago evaporated, replaced by the same cold, hard clarity she felt when solving a puzzle in the quiet of her room. She turned her back on the board and faced the blinding lights, looking not at Sterling, but past him, directly at the 2,000 faces in the dark. I can't solve these, Nia said, her voice amplified and steady. Sterling laughed, throwing his hands up in mock victory. Finally, an admission of, I can't solve them because they aren't math, Nia cut him off. The sharpness of her tone silenced the room. They are lies. She pointed the marker at the board. Professor Sterling didn't give me difficult problems. He took parts of different equations and mixed them up. It's like asking me to spell a word, but using numbers instead of letters. It doesn't mean anything. It's just noise designed to make you think he's smart and I'm stupid. Sterling's smile vanished. He lunged toward the podium. Cut her mic. Security. She is mocking this institution. Let her speak. The voice didn't come from the stage. It came from the front row. An elderly man in a tweed suit stood up. It was Dr. Eris, the retired head of the mathematics department, a legend in the university. He looked at Sterling with disappointment and then nodded at Nia. Go on, child. Emboldened, Nia turned back to the whiteboard. She grabbed the eraser and, with wide sweeping strokes, wiped away Sterling's gibberish. The dust flew into the air like smoke. This, Nia said, writing fresh, clean symbols on the board, is what the equation is supposed to look like if you respect the laws of physics. Her hand moved across the white surface with breathtaking speed. She didn't pause to think. She had lived with these numbers for 3 days. She corrected the variables, balanced the energy terms, and restored the logic that Sterling had broken. Math is about truth, she said, her voice rising as she began to solve the corrected equation. It doesn't care if you're rich. It doesn't care if you're a professor. It only cares if you are honest. She slashed the final line of the solution, circling the answer 3 times. She capped the marker with a loud click that echoed through the silent hall. She turned to Sterling, who stood frozen, his face pale, stripping him of all his arrogance. The equation is solved, Professor, Nia said softly. Math is truth. You are not. 4-3 heartbeats. There was absolute silence. Then, it started as a rumble in the back, Mr. Henderson clapping his heavy hands. Then Mama Rose stood up. Then Dr. Eris. Suddenly, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It was a thunderous, floor-shaking ovation. 2,000 people stood on their feet, cheering not just for a math problem, but for the tiny girl in the gray hoodie who had stared down a giant and won. Sterling stood alone in the spotlight, ruined, as the deafening roar of justice washed over him. The headlines the next morning didn't call her a ghetto kid or a delusional student. They called her the girl who outsmarted the Ivy Tower. The university, desperate to salvage its reputation from the wreckage Professor Sterling had left behind, acted swiftly. Sterling was fired for academic fraud before the sun had even set on his humiliation. And 2 days later, a courier arrived at Nia's freezing apartment with a check for exactly $200,000. It was Thanksgiving morning when the moving truck pulled up to the small, brick bungalow on the quiet side of town. It wasn't a mansion, but it had a sturdy roof, a porch for Mama Rose's rocking chair, and most importantly, a furnace that hummed with a steady, comforting warmth. For the first time in years, Nia watched her grandmother sleep without wearing a coat, her breathing deep and peaceful. But Nia wasn't done. The bet was never just about her survival. It was about respect. That afternoon, while the turkey was roasting, Nia walked back to Roosevelt Middle School. The building stood silent and gray in the snow, but Mr. Henderson was there at the gate, tipping his cap as she approached. Miss Miller was waiting in the main office, looking confused about why Nia had asked to meet on a holiday. Nia pulled an envelope from her pocket. Inside was a cashier's check for the remainder of the winnings after the house. There was still over $80,000 left. She placed it on Ms. Miller's desk. This is for a new boiler, Nia said simply. And for the library. No more books from 1995. And no more freezing in class. Ms. Miller's hands shook as she picked up the check. Tears spilled over her cheeks, landing on the paper. Nia, you could have kept this. You earned this. I have what I need, Nia smiled, looking over at Mr. Henderson. But genius can't grow in the cold. I want the next kid who sits in my desk to be warm enough to dream. Mr. Henderson let out a watery chuckle and walked over to the ancient thermostat on the wall. With a ceremonial flourish, he cranked the dial up. For the first time in a decade, the pipes clanged and hissed, Not with failure, but with the rushing sound of heat filling every corner of the school. As Nia walked back home through the snow, the biting wind didn't bother her anymore. She looked up at the winter sky, realizing she had solved the most important equation of all. Intelligence might win arguments, but kindness? Kindness is the only thing that changes the world. And this winter, everyone was going to be warm. Nia's journey reminds us that true brilliance often wears the humblest clothes, and the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most honest. We sometimes judge a book by its worn cover, forgetting that the most beautiful chapters are hidden inside. When we choose kindness over arrogance, we don't just solve problems, we heal communities. If this story warmed your heart today, please share it to remind someone that even the smallest light can break the deepest cold.